express my condolences to the Imam of the time, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hassan al-Askari, Ajjalallahu ta'ala farjahu al-Sharif, and to the whole Ummah, the nation of the Islam, and to you, my dear brothers and sisters, for the 40th day of the martyrdom of Imam Hussain, the Arbaeen. As you all know, now our brothers and sisters from all over the world, alhamdulillah, after a year of closure of the Arbaeen or visiting the shrine of Imam Hussain, now it's been opened, although with some limitations, I would say, but they are with all love and compassion. They left their countries and they are walking as we speak. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to have accepted their sincere devotion that they have put. We have some from our community here, they have gone. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring them back and make them return safely, inshallah. A couple of announcements. Some people asked me about the 28th of Safar's program. Our first program is going to be Monday night. Monday night, October the 4th. Monday night, October 4th. And October 5th is going to be, we're going to have two nights program. We usually had Arbaeen 2 or 3 nights in the past, and 3 nights at least for the 28th of Safar. But as you know, the situation that we're going through right now, in order to make sure that everybody's safe and we take precautions, inshallah, that we do all these programs with the help of Allah and trusting Allah's grace upon us, inshallah, we'll do this. So if there are some limitations in our timings, pardon us. And another pardon I want to ask from all of you to accept our excuses and pardons. We have some, it's a good news actually, we have some carpets that is like, shaped like mihrab on each person. They're going to be installed, inshallah, with the help of Allah and the help of some of our community members. October 9th, they will start. So if you see some, mess up in the back, excuse our mess. May Allah protect you, inshallah. Inshallah, it will be done, inshallah, look good with your help and the help of Allah, definitely first, and then our help. For those who would like to help the center with these programs that we have these nights, please see me after the program. I'll be more than happy to take your support for your own mosque. And some of our sisters ask if they want to follow with us, and I'm pretty sure many of you would like to. I'm going to be reciting Surah Al-Imran, ayah number 169 to maybe 4 or 5 verses, inshallah. Salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولا تحسبن الذين قتلوا في سبيل الله أمواتا ولا تحسبن الذين قتلوا في سبيل الله أمواتا بل أحياء عند ربهم يرزقون فرحين بما آتاهم الله من فضله فضله ويستبشرون بالذين لم يلحقوا بهم من خلفهم ألا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون يستبشرون بنعمة من الله وفضل وأن الله لا يضيع أجر المؤمنين الذين استجابوا لله والرسول من بعد ما أصابهم القرح للذين أحسنوا منهم واتقوا أجر عظيم الذين قال لهم الناس إن الناس قد جمعوا لكم فاخشوهم فزادهم إيمانا وقالوا حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل فانقلبوا بنعمة من الله وفضل لم يمسسهم سوء واتبعوا رضوان الله واتبعوا رضوان الله والله ذو فضل عظيم إنما ذلكم الشيطان يخوف أولياءه فلا تخافوهم وخافون إن كنتم مؤمنين ولا يحزنك الذين يسارعون في الكفر إنهم لن يضروا الله شيئا يريد الله ألا يجعل لهم حظا في الآخرة ولهم عذاب عظيم صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات أحسن الله عليكم جميعا. My dear brothers and sisters, please let's invite Samah Sayyid Mahdi al-Qazwini to the podium with the salawat, please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. قال تعالى في كتابه الحكيم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم: من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. صدق الله العلي العظيم، وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Tonight we're gathered here to commemorate the Arbaeen of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, his family and companions. And this occasion marks 40 days after the day of Ashura. And it marks going back 40 days after the actual day of Ashura, the first time that the family of the Prophet, peace be upon him, were able to visit and pay tribute and homage to those who had passed before them. We know that upon being released from Asham, from the dungeons of Asham, that before going back to Medina, which was at that time the nest of the family of the Prophet, Lady Zainab alayhi salam, Al-Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, decided to divert their path and first visit and pay homage to their master, Sayyid al-Shuhada. And that marked the first official ziyarah, visitation of that holy site. And from those days until today, every single year, there has been non-stop visitors, waves of visitors, non-stop, every single year, paying homage and respect to the Imam. There were certain times, and today we see on TV, and for those of you who have participated yourself, the relative ease at which we're able to visit. Despite the circumstances, it's still relatively accessible, relatively safe, and relatively convenient for most people who want to visit Imam Hussain alayhi salam. There was a time where if you decided to visit, you didn't, the cost was not an airline ticket or a visa or a vaccination. The cost was an arm and a leg, literally. People would have their limbs amputated just for the chance to visit the Imam. Some people would have their limbs amputated, one limb amputated, and they would return the next year and have another limb amputated This was the cost that they were willing to pay. Al-Mutawakkil al-Abbasi, who some refer to as Muhyi al-Sharia. They grant him the title Muhyi al-Sharia, meaning the reviver of the Sharia, the one who gave life to the Sharia of the Prophet. In his years as a Khalifa, tried to destroy the grave and the memory of Imam Hussain more than a dozen times. In one incident, they found that nothing was working, so they tried to reroute a portion of the Euphrates River in the direction of the grave, so they could just wash everything out. And there would be no traces, there would be no remains of the grave, so that no one would know exactly where to visit. The Quran says in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 32, يُرِيدُونَ أَن يُطْفِئُوا نُورَ اللَّهِ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ وَيَأْبَى اللَّهُ إِلَّا أَن يُتِمَّ نُورَهُ وَلَوْ كَرِهَ الْكَافِرُونَ. That they seek to extinguish the light of God by what they say, and God refuses for His light to be extinguished, even if that's what the disbelievers want. So, from those days until today, there has been a continuous stream, a continuous flow of visitors to the grave of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And this is a manifestation of what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had prophesied many years earlier. He said in the hadith, إِنَّ لِقَتْلِ الْحُسَيْنِ عليه السلام حرارة في قلوب المؤمنين لا تبرد أبدا. That surely in the hearts of the believers there is a flame, a burning flame in their hearts for the death of Hussein, which does not cool down, it does not subside, it continues. So, as we commemorate, we reflect upon the meaning and the significance of the Arbaeen. Why is it significant 1400 years later, and what are some of the lessons that we can draw from it? Well, number one, the Quran reminds us in chapter 33, verse 23, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. That among the believers, not all of the believers, but among the believers, there's a very special group. And those are the group of people who have fulfilled their vows. They have fulfilled their covenants. That they have stood by their values. They've stood by their word. They've stood by their commitments, and they do not break it, no matter how intense the situation is. And this is a description of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. This is a description of the will of the Ahlul Bayt. Imam Hussain alayhi salam, witnessing what happened on the day of Ashura, every single one of his male relatives who went out into the battlefield, one after one. It did not break his spirit. In fact, it did nothing but increase his conviction. It increased his desire. It increased his love. It increased his longing to return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Imam Hussain never backed down. Now, was he a human being that felt emotions, that felt sometimes fear, sometimes anxiety? Absolutely, every single human being does. However, he used his emotions to fuel his passion and to fuel his commitment and his dedication to move forward with his mission. Before he left to Karbala, actually before leaving to Kufa, to be technically correct, when he was in Mecca, he stood among the people and he delivered that powerful sermon in which he said, خط الموت على ولد آدم مخط القلادة على جيد الفتاة وما أولهني إلى أسلافي اشتياق يعقوب إلى يوسف. He says, I'm longing to return to my predecessors, my ancestors, his brother, his father, his grandfather. I am longing in the same way that the Prophet Yaqub was longing for his son Yusuf when he went missing for those years. Have you ever seen someone who is longing for for death to return? That kind of enthusiasm, that kind of passion, that kind of zeal, that kind of commitment, where does it come from? This is why the Quran describes them as مِنَ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ رِجَالٌ صَدَقُوا مَا عَهَدُوا اللَّهَ عَلَيْهِ. They were truthful. Who they were on the inside and who they were on the outside was one. There was no difference. There was congruence in their personality and their character. Because your personality, you can change your personality based on the circumstance. If you get a job that requires you to be in front of people a lot, maybe a sales job or any other type of position, if you've ever received training for it, they teach you on personality, smile, greet the person, say this, do that. But personality is different than our character. Character is who we are on the inside when no one is looking. So when the Quran describes these men and women as being truthful, it is describing a state of congruence within. That it's not that they say one thing or they claim one thing on the outside and do something else when nobody else is looking. Imam Hussain alayhi salam made that very clear. That whatever we are going to experience in this journey, I will be the first one to experience it in front of you. This is how a true leader leads. So, if we're to condense, as we remember and as we commemorate, if we were to condense the message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam into one idea or one concept or one purpose, if you were to break it down and say, well, what was the purpose? What was the mission? What was the vision? What is it that drove the Imam to do what he did and stand the way that he stood? It's a message of change and reform. We've all heard the statement, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If something's not broken, then there's no need to go and fix it. You fix something only when it's broken. And Imam Hussain alayhi salam saw a community that was broken. Not in terms of rituals, not in terms of recitation or memorization of the Quran, because those that fought against Imam Hussain, they had performed the Hajj, they would give sadaqah, some of them had memorized the Quran, and they would pray as well. In fact, on that very day, there were two camps, two salah, one on one side, the side of Imam Hussain, and one on the side of Umar ibn Sa'ad. It was the same adhan, same iqamah, same prayer. So it wasn't a matter of rituals that people had forgotten how to pray or how to read the Quran. That Imam Hussain said, I'm going to go out and bring change and reform so that people learn how to memorize the Quran better. Had nothing to do with that at all. There was a community that was ill, not physically, but spiritually. Spiritual, mental, and emotional illness. So, when we talk about change, and when we talk about reform, governments, candidates who run for president or prime minister, there's always some sort of message behind their campaign that we're going to change this and we're going to change that and we're going to lower taxes and we're going to do this. And most of the change that you see that is proposed by politicians these days is on the surface level. It has nothing to do with character change. It has nothing to do with changing the way that people think. It's just a change in policy. And that's why you find that what happens? If you look at countries where they have presidents or prime ministers that serve for a certain term, one administration comes in and their entire mission is to undo everything that the previous administration did and do something better than them and claim the credit when the economy is boosted or when a war ends or when something magnificent happens. There's no real lasting permanent change. Imam Hussain alayhi salam, he realized that by standing for Islah, which was what he claimed to stand for and what he did stand for, reform and change, it wasn't simply to undo the policies of the government of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. It was to change the way people thought, the way people believed, the paradigm of the people, the lens by which they saw themselves. So true reform beginning from within. So this season, as we wind down the season, what does it represent? I want to share a couple of points with you. Number one is that this season represents the rebirth of human consciousness. What do I mean by that? That with the martyrdom of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, it was a chance for the ummah to ask themselves the question that how is it that something so tragic could take place? No one would imagine that the grandson of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the founder of the faith, only 60 years later, would be subject to this type of treatment, would be subject to this type of humiliation. But when it did happen, it finally began to shake the conscience of people. Al-Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, he says in one of the ziyarah, because there's a number of ziyarat that we recite. One of them, narrated from the Imam alayhi salam, Al-Imam al-Sadiq, he says, أَشْهَدُ لَقَدْ اقْشَعَرَّتْ لِدِمَائِكُمْ أَظِلَّةُ الْعَرْشِ. He says, I bear witness that the throne of God. Now, what is the throne of God? We can't even begin to comprehend what is the throne. That the throne of God, this arsh, which is mentioned in the Quran, is shaken, it's rattled by the sight of your blood. That means that the blood of Imam Hussain alayhi salam shook everything in this universe. The arsh of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it represents the throne, it represents the starting point of this entire universe, how everything came to be. The Imam is saying that source, that place where everything came to be, that itself was shaken by the sight of your blood. أَشْهَدُ لَقَدْ اقْشَعَرَّتْ لِدِمَائِكُمْ أَظِلَّةُ الْعَرْشِ. There was no going back after that point. So the rebirth of human consciousness. It represents a commitment to truth and justice. When we gather, when we remember, when we commemorate, this is a way for us to recommit to truth and justice. That we never forget our moral and ethical roots. Where do our moral roots come from? Where do our ethical roots come from? Where do they sprout from? You know, there was a time where the Christian community here in the United States, they would wear bracelets that had the term, or not a term, but acronym WWJD. Do you know what that stands for? WWJD? It's a question and a reminder. What would Jesus do? So if you wear the WWJD bracelet, every time you're out and about, you're confused on what to do, you read, what would Jesus do? So Ashura represents for us a WWHD. And you can put that on a t-shirt and trademark it if you'd like. What would Imam Hussain alayhi salam do? What would he do in a situation like this? When you're faced with a difficulty in your life, when you feel like things are chaotic and out of control, whether it's in your personal life, relationships, finances, maybe spiritually you're not feeling too well, emotionally you're not feeling too well. You're nervous about the economy, you're nervous about your family, you're nervous about people before you who've passed, you're nervous about your children, you're nervous about this and that. This gives us a chance to think, what would Imam Hussain alayhi salam do in a situation like this? So, I'd like to share 4 points with you here to remind ourselves, what was the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam really about? Well, point number 1 is that the conflict that took place was between two was between two issues that were at the opposite end of the spectrum. The conflict was between the truth that sounded unpopular and had little public support versus falsehood that was disguised by the truth. So two exact opposites. On one hand, you had the truth that was not, it didn't sound popular, and the truth usually does not sound popular. If you think about yourself, right, most of the time we try to avoid the truth about us, right? When someone tries to tell us the truth about ourselves, we usually try to avoid it because we have, our ego, we have a sense of, we have these subliminal defense mechanisms. We want to defend ourselves, and so we're not very accepting of the truth. We have blind spots that hold us back. We have our core beliefs about ourselves and the world that hold us back. So we have the truth that sounded unpopular, and it usually does sound unpopular, and had little public support, versus on the other hand, you had falsehood, which was disguised by the truth. And this wasn't the first time. If you go back many years earlier, the Quran describes to us the atmosphere during the time of the Prophet Musa alayhi salam. Fir'aun, when Musa begins to gain popularity and gain support, and his ideas begin to gain support amongst the people of Egypt, Fir'aun turns to his people and he says this in chapter 40, verse 26, إِنِّي أَخَافُ أَن يُبَدِّلَ دِينَكُمْ أَوْ أَن يُظْهِرَ فِي الْأَرْضِ الْفَسَادِ. O people, beware of Musa. I know he's speaking certain things and he's starting to gain popularity and a following, but beware of him. إِنِّي أَخَافُ أَن يُبَدِّلَ دِينَكُمْ أَوْ أَن يُظْهِرَ فِي الْأَرْضِ الْفَسَادِ. That I'm afraid that he is going to permanently change your ways and that he is going to spread deviation throughout the land. So history begins to repeat itself. During the time of Musa, it was the same. Musa, he spoke the truth, he stood for righteousness, but what he spoke, which was the truth, was unpopular even with his own people. Forget about Fir'aun and Fir'aun's fault. Even with his own people, it was unpopular. How do we know that? Because as soon as they crossed the sea, what happened? They forgot about all of the miracles. They forgot about all the blessings, and they went back to idol worship. So you have the truth, which is the truth in itself, but it sounds unpopular, and it has very little public support. And usually in today's world, the truth sounds unpopular and has very little public support, versus the side of Fir'aun, which was falsehood disguised by the truth. And you're unable to detect it. So it's interesting because you find this paradox that the Imam alayhi salam, his murderers, they held prayers adjacent to his own prayers. Both of them cannot be right, and both of them cannot be wrong. We know that. The Prophet, peace be upon him, and this is a well-quoted hadith in different Islamic traditions, that if two Muslims come to fight one another in a group, then definitely one of them is not on the path of truth. That's obvious. The question is whom? If you go to your friends today outside the madhab of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, the ones who have actually heard what happened to Imam Hussain, the story of Imam Hussain, because many of them, they have absolutely no idea. I can't tell you how many times I've come across people who are practicing, faithful, well-intentioned, very good people, but nobody has ever told them the story of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. And there are millions of people like that across the world. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions actually, around the world. So there's two sides, falsehood disguised by truth, and truth that sounded unpopular and had little public support. This is point number one. Point number two is that the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was not against a particular government. It wasn't just a political revolution. It was an intellectual and spiritual revolution as well. Imam Hussain alayhi salam didn't put his life on the line because of politics or so that, again, like I said before, people learn how to pray and read Quran. People already had that down. It was an intellectual and spiritual revolution, just as much as it was political. We read, again, this comes from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. He describes what Imam Hussain alayhi salam gave up and what he wanted in return. This was the exchange. He says, وَبَذَلَ مُحْجَتَهُ فِيكَ لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ عِبَادَكَ مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ وَحِيرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ. He gave up, badal. What does this mean in the Arabic language? Badal means to spend or to give. Muhja, what is the muhja? This is this term is not used in common Arabic, but it has a profound meaning. Muhja is the blood that comes from the heart. Right? When you go and draw blood, where do they draw it from? They draw it from your vein. The blood from the heart that resides in the heart, that's being pumped by the heart, in the Arabic language is referred to as muhja. Imam Sadiq alayhi salam says he gave this thing that was most dear to him, Imam Hussain alayhi salam, the blood of his heart. This is what he gave. What did he want in exchange? لِيَسْتَنْقِذ, to save, عِبَادَك, your servants, humanity, مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ. What is jahala? Jahl, ignorance. وَحِيرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ, from confusion. So I will give the blood of my heart, the most precious thing to me, the most dear thing to me, so that other people, not myself, so that other people will be rescued from ignorance. Imagine the price that he had to pay. So then we begin to ask, what is true Islam, and where does true Islam actually lie? You know, what does the Quran say in chapter number 4, verse 157 about the Prophet Isa alayhi salam? وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. That they did not kill him and they did not crucify him. However, it appeared to them that way. Which shows us that if 2,000 years later, billions of people in the world can still be confused about what actually happened to Isa alayhi salam, and this is just an example, then 1,400 years later, people will still be confused about what happened on the day of Ashura. So this is point number 2. Point number 3 is that some people ask the question that when it comes to early Muslim conflict, and this is the difficult part, is that how do we address early Muslim conflict? You know, these are not comfortable conversations. Because if you open up the door and one scholar, one scholar not from the madhab of Ahlul Bayt, he was saying it this way. He said that, you know, we grew up and nobody ever told us about Imam Hussain. Nobody ever told us and taught us about what happened in Ashura. And there's a reason behind that. Because if you're to ask about Ashura, then you have to ask, okay, well, what caused it? What caused it? Did it just happen out of a vacuum? That all of a sudden, you know, here's Karbala, and then all of a sudden Imam Hussain lands here and Umar ibn Sa'd lands here and fight it out? Or was there a precursor? What happened before? Who was in charge? What were the circumstances? Who appointed who? These are very uncomfortable questions. Who appointed who? Well, if you ask about Yazid, who appointed Yazid? His father, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who ruled autonomously in the land of Asham for more than a decade before he placed his son in charge. Who appointed Muawiyah? You can go read about that. So when you learn who appointed Muawiyah, then the real question comes up. Who put him there in the first place? See, when it comes to trying to figuring out the challenges of the world, there was a professor who a number of years ago, and if you've heard of this, it was called the Stanford Prison Experiment, I think. There was a professor at the University of Stanford, and he set up a mock prison with his students. And he was trying to figure out the relationship between evil, the perpetration of evil, and authority. And how when people have an authority who is pushing them towards evil, how they are influenced. And he was trying to figure out the question of, can certain people who perpetrate evil, can we blame them, or do we have to blame their superiors? Can we hold them responsible, or do we hold their superiors responsible? And this was, this experiment that he conducted, it coincided with the trial of a Nazi officer that took place, I believe, in 1961. There was a Nazi officer who had fled. He had gone to Argentina. They caught him. He was responsible for many murders and in the Holocaust and all of that. He was one of Hitler's right-hand men, and they started his trial. So this professor, he said, you know what? What if it wasn't him? What if he's not at fault? What if it's other forces? So he wanted to examine that. So they set up a prison, a mock prison. And they picked out 24 young men who they screened beforehand. They made sure that they didn't have any convictions or arrest warrants or anything like that. And they decided, as they built this mock prison in one of the basements of Stanford University, that 12 of those involved would be the prison guards, and 12 of them would be the prisoners, but they would be drawn at random. So if you participated, you didn't know, were you gonna, be a prison guard or an actual prisoner? So 12 of them assigned here, 12 of them assigned there, and then he assigned himself as the superintendent or the warden. And he encouraged the prison guards to belittle and abuse the prisoners. Now, mind you, they all knew that this was just a play. It was just, they were mocking. And they had decided to run the experiment for 2 weeks, but it came to a screeching halt after 6 days. Because some of those prisoners, they began to lose their mind. One of them, they said it was so difficult that he began to bang his head against the wall. And the point that the professor was trying to make is that even though it was mock, even though it was made up, that they had internalized their roles and they had taken themselves seriously. So as he's giving this talk, he says, look, when it comes to evil, some people believe that there are dispositional causes to evil. Some people believe it's a situational cause, and some people believe in systemic causes. So what's the difference between those three categories? Well, we've all heard the statement that one bad apple ruins the whole barrel. He says, if you were to look at it from a dispositional point of view, you would say that, okay, well, we have to figure out what's wrong with this one rotten apple. If you were to look at it from a situational point of view, you would look at the entire barrel and say, okay, well, what is it about this barrel and the way that it was designed or engineered that caused one apple to rot and spread the rotting to the other apples? But if you were to look at it from a systemic, the problem is not dispositional, it's not situational, it's a systemic problem. You would go to the maker of the barrel. How did they engineer the barrel? What were they thinking? So when it comes to evil, we start to look at it from a different perspective. That it's not just situational. It's not just dispositional. When we send curses and condemnation upon fulan and fulan and fulan, it's not just about them. It's about the system that allowed them to commit the evil that they committed. This is the true point behind commemorating the movement of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. So that when we move forward, we're not only looking at A, B, and C, we're looking at the entire system. We're looking at it from a holistic point of view. So, this is a third point. The fourth is that Imam Hussain alayhi salam, with his movement, the season of Ashura and the season of Arbaeen it's a time of resistance. And when we talk about resistance, it's not just resistance against the political rulers on the throne or behind the pulpit. Resistance against our own self, and nafsul ammara, that all of us have a dictator that resides within us. All of us have a tyrant that resides within us. How do we fight that dictator? How do we fight that tyrant? Because if you can practice self-mastery, if you can defeat your own tyrants and demons and despots that live within, you won't have to worry about the world around you. So many of us, we're trying to change the world around us when we should really be changing ourselves and what's within. This is the true message of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. This is why we remember him year after year for 1400 years. You know, the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad, they tried to break the spirit. They tried to break the will. They tried to break the resolve of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. The abuse was not only physical, the abuse was psychological. Cutting them off from water, trying to bribe people to abandon the Imam, making it strategically and tactically extremely difficult for the Imam to emerge victorious, cursing him, swearing at him, blaming him, saying to him things like, you brought your family to death, and that if the entire world was made of water, that you would not drink, that we would make sure that we prevented you from drinking that water. In every which way they tried to break the spirit of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. But it did nothing except to increase his strength, to increase his resolve. Because when you have a clear purpose, when your life is on purpose, the hardships, the challenges that you begin to face, they do nothing but increase in your will, increase in your resolve, strengthen your spirit. You know, I learned recently that athletes who get into fighting, mixed martial arts and taekwondo and that sort of thing, that some of them, when they're practicing, they'll use their hands and their feet to strike at a solid object, either a palm tree or a wall. And the reason they do that is because the more that they strike, what begins to happen? The bones begin to break down, and the fibers and the muscles and all that begin to break down. But what happens after that? They begin to regenerate. But when they regenerate stronger than they were previously. Because the body, it says to itself that if I'm going to take this kind of treatment, I need to be very strong. So when the bones and the body rebuilds itself, it rebuilds itself even stronger. So when you have a clear purpose in mind, and when you're moving forward towards a mission, a goal, and a vision, when you have obstacles in front of you, it does nothing except to strengthen your resolve. It does nothing except strengthen your commitment. And as the community, those who claim to follow the Imam and love the Imam, we see challenges all around us in today's world. We see grave injustices happen. We see things that we feel are not within our control. And for a lot of us, that creates anxiety. Some people become depressed. Some people become weary. Some people want to give up because they feel helpless of what's happening around the world. If anything, we need to keep our hearts strong. We need to keep our minds and our spirits strong. And one way to do that is to remember the tragedy of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Because as we remember, we become stronger spiritually. Emotionally, we become stronger. You may not feel it, but do you know where you feel it? You feel it in places where there is no remembrance of Imam Hussain alayhi salam. You see the chaos that's going out there in the world today. People live day to day, drifting, without any values, without any purpose. Well, for us, we use the remembrance of Imam Hussain alayhi salam as a solid bedrock to ground us, to help us move forward through life. During the days of Arbaeen, Imam Hussain alayhi salam, his family, his womenfolk, led by the noble Lady Zainab, led by his son, Imam Zainul Abidin, were paraded from one city to another. They left Karbala, initially went to the city of Kufa, from there to Asham, and from there back to Karbala, rather than returning to Medina. And when they returned to Medina, that caravan, that noble caravan that had departed only 2 months earlier, had come back looking completely different. The leader of that caravan, Sayyid al-Shuhada, was no longer there. The protector of the caravan, Abu al-Fadl al-Abbas, was no longer there. Ali al-Akbar, the one who resembled the Prophet physically, his physical appearance, his mannerisms, his demeanor, he was the most resemblant and the most similar to the Prophet in every single aspect. Even the 6-month-old child of Imam Hussain alayhi salam was not spared. They tried to erase the memory of everything that was noble. And had it not been for the brave stance of Lady Zainab alayhi salam, who threw herself upon the body of Imam Zainul Abidin to protect him, there would be no lineage. There would be no legacy. If you were to analyze the survivors on that day, you'd say that this is truly a miracle, because from the line, from the descendants of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, the one who survived was Imam Zainul Abidin, who was so ill that he came close to death. In fact, on that final stance before Imam Hussain going out for that last time, and he called, is there anyone to come support us? Is there anyone to come to our aid? The reports say that Imam Zainul Abidin, even though he was ill, to the point where he was bedridden, he stood up to defend his father. And his sword was dragging on the floor behind him. Imagine, he did not even have enough power to hold his sword up. It was dragging on the floor behind him. This was the survivor from the lineage of Imam Hussain. From the lineage of Imam al-Hasan, there was also only one survivor that was injured in battle. Al-Hasan al-Muthanna, his name was also Al-Hasan. He was injured in battle, almost killed, but then he was saved and he was brought back to Medina. And he lived a full, wholesome life. He became a scholar that people began to follow. And today, every Sayyid that you see who's from the descendants of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam is from this one individual. This is why I mentioned the verse in the beginning, يُرِيدُونَ لِيُطْفِئُوا نُورَ اللَّهِ بِأَفْوَاهِهِمْ, that they tried to extinguish the light of Allah. They tried to turn off the light of Allah by what they say. So coming back from Karbala to Medina, the caravan looked much different. Narrations say that as that caravan began to slowly tread towards Al-Madinah, there was a poet by the name of Bishr ibn Hadlam, and he met Al-Imam Zainul Abidin on the outskirts of Medina. The Imam said to him, he said, "O Bishr, we know that your father was a poet, and I know that you also recite poetry." He said, before we enter, because imagine, up until that point, every city that that Lady Zainab alayhi salam went into, nobody, upon entering the city, nobody had any idea who they were. The Imam did not want to repeat this in his own city, the city of Medina. So he told Bishr, he said, before we go, you go, and start to announce with your poetry what happened. Every city that they went to, people thought that these were just thugs, terrorists, insurgents that were being put to justice. Sahel ibn Sa'id al-Sa'idi, one of the men who had lived long enough to hear the Prophet, peace be upon him. He was one of the companions of the Prophet. When he comes to Asham, he finds, and this coincided with the entrance of the family of the Prophet, he finds there's a group of people standing at the gates, the entrance of the city. And he finds that the city is lit up. There's lights, People are jubilant, people are celebrating, they're passing out food. Sahel thinks to himself, he says, am I missing something? He says, is there a Eid that I don't know about? Is there a particular celebration that I don't know about? Until finally he comes and he sees this group that are in chains. And he begins to speak to them. He finally finds Imam Zainul Abidin. And at first he doesn't recognize him. Until finally he recognizes who he was. He says, you're the grandson of the Prophet? What are you doing here? Imam Zainul Abidin, by that time, he had no words. Imagine, again, the humiliation. Imagine the humiliation of having to describe what happened. He says, Ya ibn Rasulullah, anything that you request from me, please. He says, anything that I can do for you, please let me know. He says, I just have one request. He says, I need you to give me do you have an extra piece of cloth? A piece of cloth that you don't use, that you're not using. Do you have an extra piece of cloth? He says, why? He says, because these chains and these shackles that are around my neck and around my arms, they're digging into my neck. And I'd like to take something to place it between the shackle and my neck to prevent it from eating into my flesh. This was his only request from Sahel. Imagine the humiliation, the torture. Narrations tell us that as they were treading along, as they were moving along, and as the heads of Imam Hussain and his family members were hoisted up on the spears, one of the daughters of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, she was not used to being looked at by so many people. These were the daughters of the Prophet. They were protected in their homes. They were not used to being looked at by many people. She turns to one of the soldiers. She says, I have a request for you. She says, I will give you whatever you want. I just want you to hoist the head of my father high up so that it diverts the tension away from us. I don't want people looking at us anymore. Imagine the humiliation they suffered for weeks on end. For what sin? What did they do with their lives in order to suffer this type of humiliation? As they were entering, Bishr ibn Hadlam, he enters before them, this time to introduce the family into Medina, because every city that they had gone into, people did not know who they were until they were told who they were. So the Imam tells him, oh Bishr, go inside, recite some poetry, tell the people, let them know what happened to Hussein alayhi salam. Bishr begins to recite the verses of poetry. Ya ahla Yathrib la muqama lakum biha. This is from the Quran. This is a verse from the Quran. Ya ahla Yathrib la muqama lakum biha. قتل الحسين فأدمعي مدرار الجسم منه بكربلاء مضرج والرأس منه على القناة يدار. O people of Medina, do you know what's up? Do you know what the news is? Do you know what's happening in the world? Hussein has been killed and his head has been separated from his body. His body lies by the banks of the Euphrates and his head is being paraded in every city as if it was a trophy. When the news reaches the people of Medina, one of those people was there waiting anxiously in anticipation, and that was Lady Baneen, this noble lady who had given 4 of her sons in battle for Imam Hussain alayhi salam. She meets Lady Zainab, she meets Imam Zainul Abidin. She does not recognize them because of what happened. Imam Zainul Abidin, he goes directly to her and he begins to give her condolences. 4 sons she had given away. He begins to give her condolences on them. Each one of them, when he mentions their name, she says, I did not ask you about my sons. I asked you about Hussein. What happens to Hussein? And at that moment, he says, Sayyidati عظم الله لك الأجر. My condolences to you. بولدك الحسين. For your son Hussein who has been killed. Reports say that at that moment, she fell to the floor weeping. She could not hold herself standing. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. صلوا على محمد وآل محمد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا رحمن يا رحيم يا أرحم صلى الله عليك يا مولاي يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. همه با هم السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى صحاب الحسین. خوش به حال اونایی که الان کربلا هستن. خدا میدونه سعادت میخواد. خوش به حال شما رو که آقا قبول کرده امشب اینجا باشین. به خدا دعوت شدین، نام اومده امضا شده، بار بگشایید اینجا کربلاست. آب و خاکش با دل و جان آشناست. بر مشام جان رسد بوی شهرش، به به از این تربت مین و سرش. کربلا ای آفرینش را هدف، قبلگاه عاشقان از هر طرف. تور عشق است و مطاف انبیا، نور حق اینجاست ای موسی بیا. جسم را احیا اگر عیسی کند، جان و تن را کربلا احیا کند. گر سلامت رفت از آتش خلیل، نور سار الله شد او را دلیل. کیست زینب والله، کیست زینب واله و شیدای حق، همچو مادر اسمت کبرای حق. کیست زینب بنت زهرای بتول، دخت حیدر پاره قلب رسول. کیست زینب زاده بیت الحرام، حور زمزم دختر رکن و مقام. کیست زینب مظهر صبر خدا، بر زمین و آسمان فرمان روا دلبرم. یوسف زهراست خدا میداند، یادش آرامش دلهاست خدا میداند، علت غیبت او هست گناه من و تو، خون جگر از گناه ماست خدا میداند. الان معلوم نیست آقا کجای عالم داره مناجات میکنه، کجا داره برای من و شما دعا میکنه. چرا هر کی آقا رو زیارت کرده، آقا رو خیمه نشین زیارت کرده، هر کی یوسف زهرا رو دیده تو بیابونا تنها و غریب بوده، مگه این آقا تو بین ما، تو شهر ما، تو خونه های ما جا نداره؟ از امیر المؤمنین طلب کردن مهدی فاطمه رو برای ما آقا معرفی کنید. حضرت با 4 جمله معرفی کرد، فهمود صاحب هذا الامر ان الشرید الطرید الفرید الوحید، یعنی مهدی من غریبه، مهدی من تک و تنهاست، مهدی من از شهرها رانده شده. خوش به حال اونایی که توی دو ماه عزاداری کردن، یه کاری کردن، یه عملی انجام دادن، دل مولا امام زمان رو به دست آوردن. چقدر دنبال این بودی یه کاری کنی امام زمان تو خوشحال کنی، امشب اومدی شام اربعین بگی یا بقیت الله، منم مثل شما به تأسی از شما خودتون فرمودین اگه کربلا نبودم، اگه نبودم روز عاشورا یاریت کنم یا جدا، فلندبنک صباحا و مسا، شب روز برات گریه میکنم. امام زمان آری اعمال من و توست، حجاب من و تو، ورنه آن چهره هویداست خدا میداند. اینقدر مولا روزه عمه جانش و ارادت داره، به شیخ حسین سامرایی دستور داد به شیعیان ما بگو خدا رو به حق عمه زینب قسم بدم موانع فرج من برطرف بشه، امشب دلاتون رو کجا ببرم، کدام گوشه روزه رو بخونم، انشاءالله چشمی نباشه که گریان نباشه. پیغمبر فرمود فاطمه جان همه چشمای توی قیامت گریانه، غیر از او چشمی که بر حسین تو گریه کنه. آماده ای یا نه دلاتو ببریم کربلا، اون روزی که آقا دوست داره در مورد بیبی زینب خونده بشه. وقتی رسید قافله در مجلس یزید، بالا گرفت قافله در مجلس یزید، اونم یا صاحب از زمان چه گذشت به عمه جان شما در این مجلس. امام زمان وارد مجلس ما محرم، مجلسی که همه مشغول لهو و لعبن، همه مشغول میگسارین، همه مشغول شادین، سرای بریده رو بالای نیزه زدن. این زن و بچه ابی عبدالله در لباس اسیریان، دیده سر بریده داره اشک میریزه. ابی عبدالله یه لحظه چشمانشو باز کرد، اشک از سر بریده در آمد، اشک سر بریده در آمد که پا گذاشت. زینب میان سلسله در مجلس یزید، همه از کنیم یا حسین.
نگاه گریه داری داشت زینب، نگاه گریه داری داشت زینب، چه گام مقام استواری داشت زینب. 40 منزل حسین منجلی شد، گهی زهرا شد و گاهی علی شد. ندیدم زینب کبرا تر از این، ندیدم زینب کبرا تر از این، ندیدم زینت بابا تر از این، ندیدم دختر زهرا تر از این، حسینی مذهبی غوغا تر از این. اگرچه قصه دارد آه دارد، به پایش خستگی راه دارد. پس از آن که زمین را زیر و رو کرد، بیبی زینب هر شهره میرفت، هر شهره که میرفت یه روزه‌داری انجام میداد. اولین کسی که روزه رو شروع کرد حضرت زینب بود. هر شهری که میرفت. پس از آن که زمین را زیر و رو کرد، سپاه کوفه را بی آبرو کرد. رسیدم کربلا ای داد بیداد، حسین سرجادا ای داد بیداد. 40 روز است گریانم حسین جان، 40 روز است گریانم حسین جان، چه موی تو پریشانم حسین جان. همه صدا بزنید حسین جانم، صداش بزن. روز اربعینه، شب اربعین عیده. میگه همینجا دور اکبر را گرفتند، زماشب پیامبر را گرفتند. روز اربعین که رسیدن کربلا، اینا زبان حال زینبه. میگه همینجا بود که سقای ما رفت، به سمت علقمه سقای ما رفت. همچین که ناقه ها به سرزمین کربلا رسید، این زن و بچه ها خودشان را به زمین انداختند. تنها کسی که میدونه قبرها کجاست امام سجاده. همه دور آقا رو گرفتند. یکی میگه آقا قبر آقامون کجاست، یکی میگه آقا قبر عباسمون کجاست، یکی میگه قبر قاسممون کجاست. هر کسی دنبال یه قبریه، اما همه اومدن اول قبر امام حسین رو دورش گرفتن، همه گریه میکردن. یه نفر اومد گفت آقا قبر پسرم علی اصغر کجاست؟ اومد پاشه آقا گفت همینجا بشین، قبر فرزندت رو سینه آقا مونه. اینجا دیگه زینب خیالش راحته، دیگه تازیانه نیست، دیگه کسی را اذیت نمیکنه، بدون همه راحت دارن گریه میکنن. هر کی یه جایی روزش رو شروع کرده، یه مرتبه دیدن دختری داره به طرف علقمه میره، دیدن یه مشک رو پر آب کرده، میگه عمو چشمت رو باز کن، عمو چشمت روشن، عمو پاشو دوباره زینب آمده، با تو رکاب کن عمو. آخه دوباره زینب برگشته. سکینه یه جمله به عموش گفت تا تو بودی خیمه ها آرام بود، دشمن از بی حرمتی ناکام بود. ای زاربان آهستران، دارد توانم میرود. عزیزان تشریف برید جلو. شب اربعین دعا میکنیم که خداوند به حق این شبای مقدس و حق خون امام حسین، یه بار دیگه قبل از این که لااقل خودم رو دارم میگم، قبل از که از دنیا برم یه اربعین دیگه انشالله همگی اونجا بریم، از نزدیک نوکری آقا رو بکنیم انشالله. ای ساربان آهستران، دارد توانم میرود. ای ساربان آهستران، دارد توانم میرود. در این زمین پر بلا، از غم انانم میرود. یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین جواب، یا حسین یا حسین. از خاک اینجا بوی هجران و جدایی میرسد، گویا همین جا از تن رنجیده جانم میرود. اینجا لب خشکیده را با تیر آبش میدهد، اینجا لب خشکیده را با تیر آبش میدهد. گفتم آتش سوزم چو آتش بر زبانم میرود. اینجا مقام دیدن ذبیح اعظم است، اینجا مقام دیدن ذبیح اعظم است، که از داغ او شادی ز کل دودمانم میرود. اینجا من و تاریکی و غربت به هم محرم شویم، باید ببینم روی نی ماه زمانم میروم. دوران یا بنت امیر المؤمنین من گذشت، وقت اسیری آمد و نام و نشانم میروم. زین پس به روی ناقه بی پرده میخوانم نماز، بعد از علی اکبرم، بعد از علی اکبرم دیگر از آنم میروم. من خود به چشم خیشتن، من خود به چشم خیشتن باید ببینم بی کفن روی سرم رأست بنی روی سرم رأست بنی چون سایه بارم می رود یا حسین و یا حسین و یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین یا حسین
میخونم تا بدونم امیر و مقتدام کیه تا بدونم که گدای کیم و آقام کیه تا بدونم که گدای کیم و آقام کیه اونی که پر میزنه دل به هواش اونی که ریخت خدا تموم عالمو به پاش اونی که علی میگه الهی من بشم فداش اونی که مرده رو زنده میکنه با یه نگاش اونی که خدا میخونه روز و شب روزه براش اونی که آرزومه تا جون بدم رو قدماش اونی که حضرت زهرا شده صاحب عزاش اونی که ذکر لب فرشته هاست یک نفره اربابم حسینه که از عالمی سره بگو اربابم حسینه که از عالمی سره بگو ارباب حسینه که از عالمی سره اونی که پر میزنه دل به هواش اونی که ریخت خدا تموم عالمو به پاش اونی که علی میگه الهی من بشم فداش اونی که مرده رو زنده میکنه با یه نگاش اونی که خدا میخونه روز و شب روزه براش اونی که آرزومه تا جون بدم رو قدماش اونی که حضرت زهرا شده صاحب عزاش اونی که ذکر لب فرشته هاست یک نفره اربابم حسینه که از عالمی سره بگو اربابم حسینه که از اربابم حسینه که از اونی که بالاتر از ماه خداست محرمش علی اونی که بالاتر از ماه خداست محرمش اونی که تموم عالمن گدای کرمش اونی که جون داده به عالم و آدم از دمش اونی که خدا میخواد بالا بمونه پرچمش اونی که آدم میسازه توی بزم ماتمش اونی که آدم میسازه توی بزم ماتمش اونی که حضرت عباس شده صاحب علمش اونی که حضرت عباس شده صاحب علمش اونی که بال و پر فرشته ها باز شده زیر قدمش اونی که باب المراد انبیاس یک نفره اربابم حسینه که از عالمی سر نمیگی جانم یه بار دیگه اربابم حسین ارباب اونی که بند دل فاطمه از داغ غمش پاره شده، اونی که دنبال کاروان عشقش دلم آواره شده، اونی که هر کی شنید وصفش و بیچاره شده، اونی که پیش خدا حسابش از همه جداست یک نفره، اربابم حسینه که از عالمی سره. بگو ارباب عالمی سر، اربابمه، ارباب نه که از اونی که مهدی فاطمه شده سینه زنش، اونی که 3 روز رو خاک کربلا مونده تنش، اونی که زینب و کشت قصه پیراهنش، اونی که با لب تشنه جدا شد سر از تنش، اونی که 1000 تا زخم نیزه بود رو بدنش، اونی که کشته شد و کسی نکرده کفنش، اونی که قریب دشت کربلاس یک نفره، اونی که قریب دشت کربلاس یک نفره، اربابم حسین نه که از عالمی سره. نمیگی اربابم حسین که از عالمی سره، اربابم حسین نه که از اونی که مهدی فاطمه شده سینه زنش، اونی که 3 روز رو خاک کربلا مونده تنش، اونی که زینب و کشت قصه پیراهنش، اونی که با لب تشنه جدا شد سر از تنش، اونی که 1000 تا زخم نیزه بود رو بدنش، اونی که کشته شد و کسی نکرده کفنش، اونی که قریب دشت کربلاس یک نفره، اونی که قریب دشت کربلاس یک نفره، اربابم حسین نه که از عالمی. بگو اربابم حسین علی هر زمانی به میان حرف قمر می آمد. چند بیتی هم برای خانم ام البنین بخونی. هر زمانی به میان حرف قمر می آمد، پرتو مادریت مد نظر می آمد. هر زمانی به میان حرف قمر می آمد، پرتو مادریت مد نظر می آمد. پرورش دادن مردی به بلندای ادب، پرورش دادن مرد به بلندای ادب، فقط از عهده دامان تو برمی آید. حسین 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 جان پسرانت همه چون شیر شجاعت دارند، پسرانت همه چون شیر شجاعت دارند. به تو این بنینی چقدر می آید، به تو این بنی چقدر می آید، به تو این بنی چقدر می آید. 4 تا قبل کشیدی بگو اصلا اینها به قد و قامت آن 4 پسر می آید، به قد و قامت آن 4 پسر می آید. حسین 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 حسین
حسین حسین حسین حسین حسین حسین سه سال دختر سالار زینب، سه سال دختر سالار زینب، رقیه اولین غمخوار زینب، رقیه اولین غمخوار زینب. سه سال دختر سالار زینب، سه سال دختر سالار زینب، رقیه اولین غمخوار زینب، رقیه اولین غمخوار زینب. به دستش جانماز سبز بابا، به دستش جانماز سبز بابا، نیامد از چه سوی خیمه بابا، نیامد از چه سوی خیمه بابا. کشد ظالم به رحموهای ممه، کشد ظالم به رحموهای ممه، ببین زخمی شده پاهای ممه، ببین زخمی شده پاهای ممه. به غساله بگو گر من که بودم، به غساله بگو گر من که بودم، اگر آتش گرفته تار و پودم، اگر آتش گرفته تار و پودم. غم بابا مرا نیلوفری کرد، غم بابا مرا نیلوفری کرد، سر بابا برایم دلبری کرد، سر بابا برایم دلبری کرد. شنیدم صوت قرآن پدر را، شنیدم صوت قرآن پدر را، ببر عمه مدینه این خبر را، ببر عمه مدینه این خبر را. رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه جانم، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه. دلا دنیا به یک ارزن نیرزد، دلا دنیا به یک ارزن نیرزد، دعا کن تا دلی هرگز نلرزد، دعا کن تا دلی هرگز نلرزد. دعا کن خیمه ای آتش نگیرد، دعا کن خیمه ای آتش نگیرد، یتیمی که سر راهش نگیرد، یتیمی که سر راهش نگیرد. حسابم در قیامت با حسین است، حسابم در قیامت با حسین است، صدای قلب زینب با حسین است، صدای قلب زینب یا حسین است. بنشتم گشت خاک پای زینب، بنشتم گشت خاک پای زینب، برایم کعبه دل قبر زینب، برایم کعبه دل قبر زینب. شکستن صبح عاشورا سرم را، شکستن صبح عاشورا سرم را، دلیل کار من فتوای زینب، دلیل کار من فتوای زینب. رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه، رقیه جان، رقیه جان، رقیه. صلی الله علیک یا مولای یا ابا عبدالله وعلى الارواح التي حلت بفنائك عليك مني سلام الله ابدا ما بقيت و